It all started with something as simple and natural as rain. Living in a dry part of the country, every drop mattered. So when I installed a basic rainwater collection system to save water for my garden, I thought it was a smart and responsible thing to do. It wasn't fancy. Just a couple of barrels at the end of my gutter pipes, collecting runoff when the skies finally opened up. I used that water to keep my plants alive, to wash the car, even to clean the patio when restrictions were in place. But apparently, the HOA saw it differently. The first letter I got didn't even mention rainwater. It was vague, something about non-compliant exterior modifications. I figured they were talking about a fence or maybe my shed. So I ignored it. Then came another one. This time, it specifically said I was not allowed to harvest and store communal water. That phrase caught me off guard. Communal water? It was falling from the sky onto my roof. Since when did the HOA own the weather? I wrote back, calmly and clearly, explaining that the rainwater was falling on my private property, into barrels I had installed legally. I even cited local water regulations, which allowed residents to collect and use rainwater for non-potable purposes. No response. Just another notice, and then a threat of fines. I decided to stand my ground. I wasn't doing anything wrong, and I refused to remove the system. That's when things started to escalate. One day, I noticed the barrels were nearly empty, even though it had rained just a few nights before. I checked for leaks. Nothing. A few days later, it happened again. That's when I installed a small camera above the side gate. What I saw next shocked me. A man in a reflective vest, clearly working for the HOA, came into my yard while I was at work and opened the drain valves on my barrels. Just like that, all the water I'd saved was gone. They didn't even ask. No notice, no explanation. Just action. I couldn't believe it. I showed the footage to the HOA. Their reply? The man was performing necessary stormwater mitigation. According to them, my barrels were creating a backup risk. Which was absurd. They weren't even connected to any city system. They didn't respond when I asked for proof of any complaints or water flow studies. It was just another excuse. That's when I realized something important. This wasn't about rules or safety. This was about control. The HOA didn't like that I had done something on my own. Something useful. Something outside their neat little list of rules and expectations. And because they couldn't control it, they decided to destroy it. So I got creative. I studied the layout of the neighborhood. I checked old elevation maps and drainage routes. The HOA's office, a small brick building near the clubhouse, was actually downhill from my property. Not by much, but just enough to make a difference. I knew that if I rerouted the flow of water slightly, I could guide it in a way that was perfectly natural. Gravity would do the rest. No pumps. No machines. Just nature, helping me send a very clear message. I got to work slowly. I didn't want to be obvious. I dug shallow swales, just a few inches deep, starting from the back of my yard and heading in a very specific direction. I landscaped over them with decorative rocks and native grasses, so they looked like part of the garden. The next time it rained, the water followed the path beautifully. It didn't pool in my yard anymore. It moved along. Right toward the lower part of the community grounds. Right toward them. For a while, nothing happened. I kept collecting rainwater and they kept draining it until I stopped collecting and let it flow. Then came a storm. A big one. And suddenly the HOA office wasn't so dry anymore. By the next morning, there were complaints about a soggy lawn, about water running near the building's foundation. I acted surprised, of course. I even offered to help check the storm drains. But deep down, I knew exactly what had happened. After that first real storm, things shifted. The HOA didn't come knocking right away, but I could feel the tension growing. I started noticing more frequent patrols around the neighborhood. Their little white golf cart would slowly roll by my house at least twice a day, sometimes stopping, sometimes just creeping past like they were waiting for something to happen. But they didn't say a word. Not officially. What they didn't realize was that I had learned their schedule. I knew when they checked the common grounds, when the lawn guys came, and when their office hours were. I knew that on Thursday mornings, their maintenance manager made rounds, and usually did a walk around at the office. That gave me a very specific target window. I kept refining the water paths. I was careful, patient. I used small garden tools and worked during times when I knew most people were either at work or not looking. It helped that I kept the area looking neat. Anyone walking by would have thought I was just an overly enthusiastic gardener. No one questioned it. What they couldn't see was how those shallow channels under the soil and stones worked together like veins, quietly guiding the water where I wanted it to go. Then came the second storm. It wasn't as intense as the first, but it lasted longer. A steady, heavy rain for nearly 2 days. And this time, I didn't collect anything. I just let it flow. By the morning of day 2, the HOA office lawn looked different. It wasn't just soggy, it was soaked. Puddles had formed in spots that usually stayed dry. I walked by casually, pretending to take my dog out, and I could see the panic beginning. Staff members were outside, pointing at the water. Someone was using a rake to clear out what looked like a clogged drain. But it wasn't clogged. That drain was never meant to handle the amount of water now flowing directly toward it. Inside my house, I watched the camera feeds. I had a small security setup in my backyard, and the rain was still coming down, water moving cleanly through the swales, down the slope, and out past the side fence. All of it moving exactly where I intended. By the afternoon, they were using sandbags. Now, it would have been smart for them to call me and ask what was going on. Maybe try to work something out. But no. Instead, they sent me another notice. This one accused me of intentionally redirecting water in a way that caused disruption to common property. They claimed my actions were deliberate and malicious, which, of course, they were. But they couldn't prove it. I responded with a simple letter. I explained, very politely, that I had simply landscaped my property to improve water drainage and prevent erosion. I even attached a screenshot of my local water code, which stated homeowners could alter drainage on their own land, so long as it didn't involve pumps or man-made irrigation into public systems. I hadn't done either. They went quiet again, but something strange happened after that. My neighbors, some of whom had been distant or unfriendly, started to reach out. A couple of them asked about my garden project. One person even thanked me because their side yard, which always used to flood, was now drier than ever. I realized that while the HOA was busy trying to intimidate me, the actual residents were starting to notice that what I'd done wasn't just clever, it was working. I didn't brag. I didn't tell them what I was really doing. But I listened. And I learned that I wasn't the only one having issues with the HOA. One neighbor's patio project had been stopped halfway through. Another had been fined for unapproved plantings, even though they were using native, drought-resistant shrubs. We were all dealing with the same kind of heavy-handed control. That's when I decided it was time to escalate, not in a loud or dramatic way, but with precision. The next part of my plan wasn't about flooding. It was about showing them what happens when people stop being afraid, about reminding them that if they wanted to fight over control, they'd better be ready for more than just water. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere changed after that second storm. Before, I felt like I was on the defensive, just trying to protect what was mine. But now, it felt like I had the upper hand. The HOA had started something they clearly didn't know how to finish, and instead of backing down, I had found a way to turn their own nonsense against them. That week, I started documenting everything. Not because I planned to sue, but because I wanted evidence. I kept copies of all their letters. I took photos of the changes I made to my yard. I made notes on when the water flowed, how it flowed, and where it ended up. I wasn't just covering myself. I was building a case, quietly, in case they ever pushed too far. They were already feeling the pressure. At their next board meeting, which I didn't attend but could hear through a neighbor who lived nearby, they discussed emergency water flow adjustments and unusual landscaping issues on private lots. They never said my name, but it was obvious they were talking about me. I could have laughed if it weren't so ridiculous. These people had spent so long obsessing over grass heights and mailbox paint colors, and now they were scrambling over actual problems they created themselves. But while they were panicking, I was getting more precise. I extended the swales. I added a new path behind a row of bushes where no one could see. That one led toward the HOA's back parking area. Another low spot they never bothered to grade properly. The more I worked, the more I realized how sloppy their own planning was. They had spent so much energy enforcing rules, they forgot to follow basic logic. My rainwater didn't need much help finding its way there. Nature did most of the work. I just guided it. Another storm came, this one mild. Just enough to test the new paths. That morning, I took a quiet walk past their office. A few cones were set up. The rear parking area was soft and spongy. One car was parked awkwardly, clearly trying to avoid the deep spot they hadn't caught on yet. Back home, I sat on my porch and watched the clouds build again. The air felt heavy. The smell of rain was in the wind. I checked the forecast. A big system was coming. Not the kind that floods roads or knocks down trees, but the kind that sticks around for a day or two, soaking everything. I was ready. When the rain came, it was slow at first, then steady. The kind of rain that soaks into the soil before it ever pools. By midnight, the water was running exactly how I'd planned. The barrels stayed closed. My entire roof's runoff moved through the paths I had built, disappearing into the ground, reappearing farther down the hill, winding gently toward the HOA office. At noon the next day, I got a call from a neighbor. "You've got to come see this," he said, laughing. "They've got wet carpets and plastic tarps over everything. The place smells like a swamp." I didn't go right away. I waited until the next morning and took another slow, casual walk. The office door was propped open with a fan blowing air out. A maintenance worker stood outside with a mop and a bucket. The flower beds were torn up, and a few hoses snaked across the lawn, trying to pump water out. I waved politely. They didn't wave back. Later that day, I got another notice in the mail. This one was more aggressive. It accused me of malicious behavior, water damage, and violation of neighborhood drainage rules. They demanded I reverse the landscaping changes and threaten legal action. It was exactly what I'd been waiting for. I drafted a detailed reply. I attached maps, elevation data, and copies of the local water laws that supported everything I'd done. I included timestamps from my camera showing that I never trespassed, never used pumps, and never violated any specific rule they could name. I wrote it calmly, clearly, and without emotion. But I also included something else. A copy of the footage showing their staff entering my property months ago to drain my barrels without permission. And a note that simply said, "If you want to go down this road, I have plenty more." The letter I sent didn't just hit them, it rattled them. For days there was nothing. No reply, no visit, not even the usual passive-aggressive notes taped to my door. The silence wasn't peace. It was strategy. I knew they were probably sitting in their little office, trying to figure out how much trouble they were really in. I had put them in a corner, and they didn't have an easy way out. But I wasn't finished yet. Just because I had proof on my side didn't mean I was going to let them get comfortable. I knew how HOAs worked, slow to react, quick to control, and terrified of bad publicity. That's when I started talking. Carefully, quietly, I began reaching out to neighbors. Not with drama. Not with gossip. Just small conversations. One at a time. I asked if they had ever had problems with the HOA. Most had. Some had received fines for ridiculous things like parking too close to their own driveway. Others had been warned about wind chimes, small flower beds, or having their trash bins visible for 5 minutes too long. The more I listened, the more I realized we were all just quietly tolerating the same abuse. One neighbor told me he was fined for putting up solar panels that were too shiny. Another said they were forced to cut down a tree that had been there before the neighborhood even existed. All of us had just accepted it. Until now. I didn't tell them about the water, not all of it anyway. I simply said I was pushing back a little and reminded them they had more power than they thought. I encouraged them to read the community bylaws, to ask for copies of meeting minutes, to attend board meetings, especially the next one. That meeting was only 2 weeks away. I knew the HOA board would use it to make a move. They'd either try to discipline me publicly or attempt to pass a rule that would force me to undo my drainage work. That's when I decided to give them something to really talk about. In the days leading up to the meeting, I made sure everything on my property was spotless. Lawn trimmed, hedges neat, not a blade of grass out of line. I even repainted the trim on my house just to be petty. If they wanted to come after me, they wouldn't be able to use appearance or property upkeep as an excuse. But I also printed 20 copies of my evidence packet. Not just the footage of them draining my rain barrels, but the letters, my landscaping design, and the laws that backed everything I'd done. Each packet was cleanly organized, stapled, and labeled. I brought all 20 copies with me to the meeting. That night, the room was more crowded than usual. A lot of my neighbors had shown up. Some out of curiosity, some out of support. The board didn't look comfortable. Their president, a man who always spoke like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama, stood and began reading an agenda. Near the bottom, I saw it. Drainage concerns on Lot 47. That was me. When they got to it, he cleared his throat and tried to sound neutral. We've received reports of water mismanagement from one property that has affected the HOA office and potentially damaged common grounds. This behavior could be considered disruptive and harmful to the community. We'd like to invite the homeowner of Lot 47 to respond. I stood up, calmly, and handed each board member a copy of my packet. I didn't say much. Just enough. My landscaping follows the code. I have not used any illegal means. You entered my property without consent and altered my water storage without notification. That footage is in the packet. You cited rules that don't exist. You tried to fine me for collecting rain. You redirected water away from my land, so I redirected it back, naturally and legally. The silence in the room was louder than anything I'd said. People started reading. Some board members flipped through the pages and avoided eye contact. One neighbor actually clapped. Just once. Quiet, but solid. The board didn't vote that night. They tabled the discussion. Said they needed more time. But by then, it didn't matter. Everyone in that room had seen what was really going on. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. They were controlling it. And now, they'd been exposed. After the meeting, everything changed. Not instantly, but you could feel it in the air. The smug silence that usually followed every HOA decision was gone. Instead, they looked nervous, unsure. They avoided eye contact in the neighborhood. The president, who used to wave like he owned the place, stopped walking his dog past my house. His confidence had cracked, and everyone saw it. Neighbors started coming up to me more openly, asking questions. Some curious, some quietly supportive. One even said, "You did what all of us wanted to do, but never dared." I hadn't realized it before, but I had accidentally become a symbol of resistance. I hadn't set out to lead anything. I just wanted my water and my rights. But the more they pushed, the more it became about something bigger. The board held a special session a week later, this time behind closed doors. No residents allowed. No minutes shared publicly. But they weren't as discreet as they thought. One of the cleaning staff, who also happened to be the cousin of my neighbor, overheard most of it. They were discussing legal exposure, risk of public complaint, liability for the damage caused by their unauthorized entry onto my property. They weren't discussing how to make things right. They were strategizing on how to avoid getting sued. That's when I filed a formal complaint, not with the HOA, but with the city. I gathered all my documentation. Every letter, every screenshot, every timestamp. I included the footage of them opening my barrels. I filed it with a local code enforcement office and asked for review of the HOA's conduct regarding stormwater management. I didn't even need to exaggerate. I simply presented the truth. City officials don't take kindly to private associations acting like they're above the law. A few days later, I got a call. A quiet, careful voice from a municipal office told me they had assigned someone to look into it. Just like that, the story wasn't limited to our neighborhood anymore. The HOA didn't know about the complaint right away, but I could see the pressure mounting. They started putting out memos, reminders about proper decorum, respect for HOA rules, and vague warnings about misinformation. I didn't respond to any of it. I just kept tending to my garden, my carefully placed swales doing their work. Every rainstorm, a quiet reminder that nature doesn't play favorites. Then, without warning, they tried a new tactic. They offered to work with me. An HOA representative showed up at my door with a smile and a folder. He talked about resolution, about finding common ground. He asked if I'd be willing to adjust my drainage paths voluntarily to avoid any future misunderstanding. It was almost laughable. I listened politely, then asked if they'd admit fault first, acknowledge the unauthorized entry onto my property, and the draining of my rain barrels. He stuttered, said he wasn't authorized to talk about that part. I said then there was nothing to discuss. They left the folder on my doorstep. I didn't open it. A few days later, a city inspector arrived. Clipboard in hand, reflective vest, measuring equipment. He walked the property with me, listened carefully as I explained what happened, took notes, nodded often. I showed him everything, without fear, because I had nothing to hide. When we reached the HOA office, he shook his head, said they were in violation of a few codes themselves. Improper grading, poor stormwater management, lack of backup drainage. He didn't say much else, just thanked me and promised to file his report soon. I didn't need to win a lawsuit. I didn't need to flood their office again. What I needed was happening, slowly, steadily, with every fact laid bare. After that, the HOA got very quiet. No more letters. No more threats. No more petty inspections. A neighbor told me their landscaper mentioned seeing a water rerouting crew surveying the area near the office. They were making changes, fixing things, quietly undoing the problem they created. The funny part? I didn't even have to touch a single drop of water again. The storm had already passed. And this time, it didn't leave damage in my yard. It left it in theirs. After the city inspector's visit, the whole neighborhood seemed to breathe a little easier. Word spread quickly that the HOA was finally being held accountable for their reckless actions. People who once feared speaking out now felt a spark of hope. I started noticing small but meaningful changes. Neighbors were slowly reclaiming their yards, planting flowers and shrubs that the HOA would have banned just months before. The atmosphere shifted from tension to cautious optimism. The board, on the other hand, retreated into their offices, no longer the confident rulers of the community. Rumors circulated that they were consulting lawyers, trying to figure out how to fix their mistakes without causing more damage. Their public meetings became shorter and less frequent, and the once frequent emails filled with fines and warnings dwindled into silence. It was clear they were overwhelmed and unsure of their next move. Meanwhile, I kept my landscaping simple but effective. The swales and drainage channels I created continued to guide rainwater away from my property and toward areas where it could safely soak in or flow without causing harm. I didn't have to do anything drastic anymore. Nature was doing most of the work, and the city was finally enforcing the rules that the HOA had ignored. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, a neighbor came by. He smiled and handed me a small packet. Inside were letters from several residents, people who had been too scared or too quiet before. They thanked me for standing up to the HOA. They shared stories of their own struggles, stories that mirrored mine. Each letter was a reminder that this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us, about fairness, respect, and standing up to those who think they can bully their way through community rules. The packets and notes fueled a new energy among us. We started organizing informal meetings, just neighbors sharing tips and support. We exchanged ideas about how to maintain our yards within the rules, but also in ways that made sense for each of us personally. We began attending the official HOA meetings, not as intimidated residents, but as informed community members ready to ask tough questions and demand accountability. I was surprised how many board members began to soften, too. Some even approached me privately, admitting they were frustrated with the old ways, but didn't know how to change. It wasn't a perfect truce, but it was a start. I realized that sometimes the fight isn't about crushing the other side. It's about finding a balance and making sure everyone is heard. The biggest lesson for me was that change doesn't happen overnight. It's slow, sometimes frustrating, but when people come together, even the smallest voices can grow into a roar. The HOA had tried to control the water, control the land, and control the people. But in the end, the community reclaimed that power. And now, every time it rains, I don't worry about the HOA or their threats. I watch the water flow freely through my yard, knowing it's no longer a weapon but a sign of life and resilience. The swamp they tried to create in their own office is drying up, just like their hold on this neighborhood. This story isn't just about rainwater or HOA rules. It's about standing firm when things seem unfair. It's about knowing your rights, using your voice, and trusting that sometimes the quietest actions can bring the biggest changes. And most importantly, it's about a community waking up and deciding they won't be bullied anymore. The water flows, the plants grow, and so do we. Even though the HOA was finally backing down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Old habits die hard, especially in places like this, where power was so tightly held by a few people who didn't want to lose control. I stayed vigilant, paying attention to every notice, every word in the neighborhood newsletter, every meeting agenda. I wanted to be ready if they tried to pull another stunt. But something unexpected happened. Instead of doubling down, the HOA started changing their approach. They launched a community survey, asking residents about their concerns and suggestions. At first, I was skeptical. A survey felt like a distraction or a PR move. But the questions were surprisingly direct, about water management, property rights, landscaping preferences, and even about how the board communicated with residents. I talked to a few neighbors who had filled out the survey, and many said they finally felt like their voices mattered. Some longtime members of the HOA stepped down, replaced by new board members who promised transparency and fairness. The tone shifted from strict enforcement to collaboration. It was a sign that maybe the HOA was learning from its mistakes. Still, I knew trust had to be earned. I continued hosting informal gatherings in my backyard, inviting neighbors to talk about what they wanted the community to look like. We shared ideas, frustrations, and hopes. The old rules that once felt suffocating started to loosen. People began planting native plants, creating rain gardens, and sharing tips on sustainable landscaping. The water that had once been a source of conflict became a symbol of renewal. When it rained, neighbors no longer worried about flooding or fines. Instead, we saw the potential to work with nature, not against it. The swales and drainage paths I built inspired others to rethink their own yards. Slowly, the neighborhood was changing, not just physically but in spirit. The HOA offices, once a fortress of control, opened their doors for community events. I was invited to speak about my experience, sharing how standing up to unfair rules led to positive change. It wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about cooperation and respect. Of course, not everyone was happy. Some old guard members grumbled in private, uneasy with the shift in power. But their voices grew quieter as more people joined the movement for a fairer community. The fear of retaliation faded. People realized that when you stand together, the HOA's influence isn't absolute. One afternoon, a local journalist reached out. They had heard about the whole water dispute and wanted to do a story. I was hesitant at first. I didn't want to be the crazy neighbor headline. But I agreed, knowing the story was bigger than me. It was about communities standing up to unfair authority, about reclaiming rights and dignity. The article ran with photos of our neighborhood gardens, the new drainage systems, and a quote from me about the power of persistence. After it published, the community buzzed with pride. More neighbors came forward with their own stories of pushing back, and the HOA's reputation took another hit. They could no longer ignore that people were watching and that they had to be accountable. Looking back, it amazes me how a simple act, redirecting rainwater, sparked a chain reaction. It wasn't just about the water or the flooding. It was about standing up when you're pushed, speaking out when you're silenced, and refusing to let fear win. The HOA thought they could control everything. But what they didn't expect was a community waking up, ready to protect its own. Now, whenever I see rainwater trickling down the gutters, I don't see a problem. I see a promise that even the smallest drops can build something strong, steady, and lasting. The fight isn't over, but it's moving forward. And with every neighbor who finds their voice, the neighborhood grows stronger. The story of the water, the HOA, and the fight for fairness is still being written. But one thing is clear. Sometimes, you have to let the rain fall, watch it flow, and trust that it will wash away more than just the dust.